Lieutenant Daniel Brooks had been stationed on Omega-7 for exactly 3 months when his life changed forever, and he thought it would be just another boring supply run through the trading district where merchants from dozens of worlds sold their goods to travelers and station residents alike. The morning started like any other morning with Daniel waking up in his small quarters on the human section of the station, and he showered and dressed in his standard uniform, making sure his name tag was properly attached to his chest because regulations required all military personnel to be clearly identified at all times. Daniel was 28 years old, and he had joined the human space fleet right out of academy 5 years ago, and he had seen some interesting things during his service, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen on this ordinary Tuesday morning. The trading post was located in the central ring of the station, where artificial gravity made everything feel almost like being back on Earth, and the ceiling was painted to look like a blue sky with white clouds, even though everyone knew they were deep in space, surrounded by the darkness of the void. Omega-7 was one of the most important neutral stations in this sector, and it served as a meeting point for dozens of different species who came here to trade and negotiate, and sometimes just to experience cultures different from their own. Daniel walked through the main corridor nodding to familiar faces as he passed, and there was Commander Chen, who worked in communications, and she waved at him with a tired smile because she had just finished a night shift. And there was the tall reptilian trader named Esrath, who always tried to sell Daniel exotic spices that he claimed would improve human cooking. The trading post itself was a massive open space filled with stalls and shops and floating display platforms that showed off products from across the galaxy, and the air smelled like a mixture of strange spices and alien foods and the metallic tang of recycled station air. Daniel had a list on his datapad of supplies that his unit needed, and it was mostly boring stuff like replacement parts for environmental suits and extra ration packs for the upcoming patrol mission, and some medical supplies that the station doctor had requested. He was standing at a booth that sold human-compatible food when he first heard the whispers starting to spread through the crowd, and people were looking toward the main entrance of the trading post and pointing at something or someone who had just arrived. Daniel looked up from his datapad with mild curiosity, and that was when he saw her for the first time. She was tall and slender, with silver hair that caught the artificial light and seemed to glow from within, and her skin had a pale, luminescent quality that marked her as one of the elven people who came from the forest world of Silvaris in a distant star system. But what really caught Daniel's attention were the 2 small dragons perched on her shoulders like trained birds, and they were no bigger than cats, but their scales shimmered with colors that shifted between deep purple and bright gold, and their eyes gleamed with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The elf woman was wearing flowing robes made of material that looked like it was woven from starlight itself, and she carried herself with a grace that made everyone around her seem clumsy by comparison. And she was clearly searching for something as her eyes scanned the crowd with an intensity that made people step back. Daniel had heard about the elven dragon keepers, but he had never actually seen one in person, and they were rare even among their own people, and it was said that the dragons chose their keepers rather than the other way around, and that the bond between keeper and dragon was sacred and unbreakable. He watched as she moved through the trading post, and her eyes sweeping across every face as if she was looking for someone specific, and the dragons on her shoulders were completely calm, despite being in such a crowded and noisy environment. And that was unusual because dragons were normally very territorial and protective. Daniel turned back to his shopping, trying not to stare because it was considered rude to gawk at other species even if they were fascinating, and he selected a few boxes of ration packs and was about to move to the next booth when he felt something shift in the air around him. It was hard to describe, but it felt like the moment before a lightning strike when all the hair on your arm stands up and you know something big is about to happen. And Daniel looked up again and found that the elf woman had stopped moving and she was staring directly at him. Her face had gone completely pale and her mouth opened in shock, and the dragons on her shoulders suddenly became agitated and their wings spread out, and they made high-pitched chirping sounds that cut through the noise of the trading post like a knife time seemed to slow down, as Daniel watched her take one step toward him, and then another, and her eyes were locked on his face, or more specifically on the name tag attached to his uniform, and he looked down at it wondering if there was something wrong with it, but it just said Lieutenant Daniel Brooks like it always did. The elf woman raised one trembling hand and pointed directly at him, and the entire trading post seemed to hold, its breath waiting to see what would happen next. Then she screamed. The sound was so loud and so unexpected that Daniel actually jumped and dropped his datapad, and it clattered on the floor and rolled under a nearby stall and people all around. Them turned to stare, and some of them pulled out their communication devices to record what was happening. "That is him," and the elf woman shouted, and her voice carried across the entire trading post. "And my nightmare. And my wedding." Daniel stood frozen, in place, completely confused about what was happening, and he had never seen this woman before in his entire life. And he definitely had not proposed marriage to anyone, and especially not to an alien from another world. The elf woman started walking toward him faster now, and her silver hair streamed behind her like a banner, and the dragons launched themselves into the air from her shoulders, and they circled above the crowd, making those strange chirping sounds that seemed almost like they were singing. Daniel backed up instinctively, and his back hit the counter of the food booth behind him, and he raised his hands in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture. "And excuse me, but I think you have me confused with someone else." But the elf woman shook her head violently in no confusion, and she said, and her voice was firm despite the tears that were streaming down her luminescent cheeks, "And I have seen your face in my dreams for 3 full cycles, and the sacred flame showed me everything, and you are Daniel Brooks, and you are my destiny." The crowd around them had grown larger now, and Daniel could see station security starting to push their way through, and he needed to figure out what was going on before this turned into an official incident that would end up on his permanent record. The 2 dragons suddenly dove down from above, and Daniel ducked instinctively, but instead of attacking him, they landed gently on his shoulders, one on each side, and their tiny claws gripped his uniform, but they were careful not to scratch him, and they made soft purring sounds like they were completely comfortable being there. The elf woman stopped just a few feet away from him, and she looked at the dragons on his shoulders and then back at his face and she whispered, "And even they know, and the dragons never lie about such things, and you are the one from my visions and the one I am meant to bond with for life." Daniel looked at the small dragons perched on his shoulders, and they looked back at him with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for animals, and one of them nuzzled against his neck, and the sensation was oddly comforting, despite the insanity of the situation. This could not be happening, and Daniel thought, and things like this did not happen to regular guys like him, who just wanted to do their job and maybe save up enough money to buy a small farm back on Earth someday. And he did not sign up for prophetic visions and arranged marriages with beautiful alien women and their magical dragons. But as he stood there with the entire trading post watching and waiting to see what he would do next, and with 2 dragons purring on his shoulders, and an elf woman staring at him like he was the answer to all her prayers, Daniel realized that his boring, ordinary life had just ended, and whatever came next was going to be anything but normal. Station security arrived within minutes, led by Chief Martinez, who was a veteran officer with 20 years of experience dealing with interspecies incidents, and she looked at Daniel with the dragons on his shoulders, and then at the elf woman, who was still staring at him with tears streaming down her face, and Martinez sighed deeply, because she could tell this was going to be one of those complicated situations that required paperwork and diplomacy. "Right, everyone, back to your business." And Martinez announced to the crowd, "And there is nothing to see here, and just a cultural misunderstanding that we will sort out peacefully." But nobody moved, because this was far too interesting to miss. And it was not every day that an elf dragon keeper claimed a human as her destined partner in the middle of the trading post, and people were already sending messages to their friends, telling them to come. "Watch." Martinez walked up to Daniel and kept her voice low and professional, "and Lieutenant Brooks, do you know this individual?" Daniel shook his head while trying not to disturb the dragons, who seemed perfectly happy sitting on his shoulders. "And no, Chief. I have never seen her before today, and I do not know why she thinks we are supposed to get married." The elf woman stepped forward and placed one hand over her heart in what Daniel would later learn was a traditional elven greeting. "And my name is Lyra Moonwhisper, and I am a keeper of the sacred dragons from the House of Starfall, on the world of Silveris, and I have traveled across the galaxy, searching for the one my visions revealed to me." Martinez looked at Lyra with the tired patience of someone who had dealt with too many strange situations to be surprised anymore, and, "Miss Moonwhisper, we need to move this conversation somewhere more private, and perhaps you can explain these visions to us And we can figure out what is actually happening here. Lyra nodded gracefully. And I will explain everything. But first, you must understand that among my people, the visions granted by the sacred flame are never wrong, and they show us the path we must walk to fulfill our destiny. The chief led them to a small conference room near the security office, and Daniel followed, with the dragon still perched on his shoulders, and Lyra walked beside him, and her presence seemed to make the air around them feel different somehow, like there was more oxygen or the temperature had changed slightly. Once they were seated in the conference room with the door closed, Martinez activated a recording device and began taking notes on her datapad. And, all right, Miss Moon Whisper, please explain from the beginning what brought you to Omega-7 and why you believe Lieutenant Brooks is your destined partner. Lyra took a deep breath and folded her hands in her lap, and the dragons finally flew from Daniel's shoulders to land on the table between them. And 3 cycles ago during the Festival of Lights, I was meditating before the sacred flame, as all dragon keepers must do when seeking guidance, and the flame showed me a vision so clear and so powerful that I could not ignore it. What did you see? And Daniel asked, because despite his confusion, he was genuinely curious about what could make someone travel across the galaxy based on a dream. I saw a man with kind eyes and a strong heart who wore strange clothes marked with symbols I did not recognize. And Lyra continued, and her voice taking on a dreamy quality as she remembered, and I saw him standing beside me as we faced a great darkness that threatened both our peoples, and I saw the dragons accepting him as their secondary keeper, which is something that has not happened in 1,000 years. Daniel leaned forward. And what is a secondary keeper? Among my people, each dragon bonds with one keeper for life, and Lyra explained. But in ancient times, when great threats arose, the dragons would sometimes accept a second keeper to help protect their primary keeper and share the burden of guardianship, and this bonding only happens when the universe itself demands that 2 souls work together. Martinez looked skeptical. And how did you find Lieutenant Brooks if all you had was a vision? The sacred flame showed me more than just his face, and Lyra said, and it showed me symbols and sounds, and I have spent 3 cycles traveling to different human stations and settlements, showing drawings of what I saw to anyone who would look, and finally someone recognized the symbols on his clothing as military insignia, and they told me that personnel matching his description might be stationed here. Daniel looked at the dragons who were grooming each other on the table, and they seemed so normal and calm that it was hard to believe they were part of some ancient mystical prophecy. And so because you had a vision, you expect me to just agree to marry you, even though we are from completely different species and have nothing in common. Lyra met his eyes, and her expression was serious, and no, Daniel Brooks and I do not expect you to agree to anything. And the vision showed me that we would choose each other. But choice is the key word, and if you refuse, then I will respect that decision, and return to my world alone. That surprised Daniel because he had assumed this was some kind of arranged marriage situation where he had no say in the matter, and you would just leave. And what about your prophecy? Prophecies show possibilities, not certainties. And Lyra said, and they show the best path forward, but we still have free will, and the sacred flame would never force 2 souls together against their wishes, and that would corrupt the very magic it represents. Martinez looked between them and Lieutenant Brooks. You are not obligated to participate in any cultural practices that make you uncomfortable. And however, I should mention that the elven people take these visions very seriously, and if Miss Moon Whisper traveled all this way based on guidance from her sacred flame, then there might be something worth investigating. Daniel ran his hand through his hair and tried to process everything he was hearing. And okay, let me get this straight. And you had a vision that showed us working together to face some kind of threat, and your dragons accepted me as a secondary keeper, whatever that means, but I still get to choose whether I want to be involved in any of this. Exactly, and Lyra said with a small smile. And the choice is always yours. To make, one of the dragons suddenly hopped across the table and climbed up Daniel's arm to perch on his shoulder again, and it nuzzled against his cheek, making that soft purring sound. And Daniel felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest, and it was like the dragon was trying to tell him something without words. What are their names? And Daniel heard himself ask. The purple one is Storm, and Lyra said, and the gold one is Ember, and they hatched from eggs I found in the crystal caves. of my homeland 5 years ago, and they have been with me ever since, and until today they have never willingly gone to another person." Storm chirped softly and seemed to be listening to the conversation with great interest, and Ember flew over to Lyra's shoulder and wrapped its tail around her neck like a living scarf. Martinez cleared her throat. "And I need to file a report about this incident." "And Lieutenant Brooks, what would you like me to say? Happened here today." Daniel looked at Lyra and saw the hope in her eyes mixed with fear and determination. And he looked at Storm, who was still purring on his shoulder, and he thought about his boring routine life and how nothing interesting ever happened to him. And here was something impossible and magical and completely insane being offered to him on a silver platter. "Tell the report that I agreed to have coffee with Miss Moonwhisper, so we can discuss her visions and learn more about each other like normal people do before making any life-changing decisions." And Daniel said finally. Lyra's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the entire station. "And thank you, Daniel Brooks, and I promise you will not regret giving me this chance to explain everything properly." Martinez nodded. "And fair enough, and just keep me informed if anything else unusual happens, and try to keep the dragons from causing any incidents in public areas. And they are technically exotic animals and need to be registered with station authorities." After the meeting ended, Daniel and Lyra walked together toward the station cafe, and Storm remained on his shoulder, while Ember stayed with Lyra, and people stared as they passed. But Daniel was starting to get used to the attention. "So," and Daniel said, "as they walked, and tell me more about Silvaris and what life is like there. And if we are going to get to know each other, I should probably learn about your home." Lyra's eyes sparkled with happiness, and she began describing her world with its massive forests that stretched across continents and trees so tall they pierced the clouds, and cities built in harmony with nature, where technology and magic worked together, and dragons flew freely through crystal-clear skies. As Daniel listened, he realized that maybe Chief Martinez was right, and maybe there was something worth investigating here. And even if the prophecy turned out to be wrong, at least he would have made an interesting friend and learned about a culture completely different from his own, and who knew? And maybe the sacred flame actually did know what it was doing when it brought them together. The station cafe was called the Cosmic Cup, and it served beverages from 20 different worlds, and the owner was a friendly alien named Crix, who had 4 arms and used all of them to prepare drinks simultaneously, and he waved enthusiastically when he saw Daniel and Lyra enter together with the dragons. Well, and Crix said with his translator device, converting his whistling language into standard English, "And this is the couple everyone on the station is talking about, and what can I get for you two?" Daniel felt his face heat up. "And we are not a couple and just 2 people having a conversation, and I will take a regular coffee." Black Lyra looked at the menu display floating above the counter, and her eyes wide with curiosity. "And I would like to try something from his world. And what do humans drink besides this coffee?" Crix made a sound that the translator interpreted as laughter. "And for a newcomer to human beverages, I recommend hot chocolate. And it is sweet and comforting, and many humans drink it when they want something." Familiar. Lyra nodded. "And then I will have that." They found a table near the window that looked out into space, and Daniel could see ships coming and going from the station, and each one carrying people with their own stories and destinies, and he wondered how many of them had their lives turned upside down by prophecies from magical flames. Storm was still perched on Daniel's shoulder and seemed content to stay there, and Ember flew around the cafe once before landing on the table between them, and both dragons watched the people passing by with great interest. "So," and Daniel said after Creeks brought their drinks, "and tell me how these visions actually work. And do you just stare into a fire and see the future?" Lyra wrapped her hands around the warm cup and smiled. "And it is more complicated than that. And the sacred flame is not an ordinary fire, but a living manifestation of the universe's will, and it burns in the Temple of Stars on my home world and has burned there for 10,000 years without ever going out." Daniel sipped his coffee and tried to keep an open mind. "And, okay, so this eternal magical fire shows you visions. And how do you know they are real and not just dreams or imagination? Because the visions always come true." And Lyra said simply, "And perhaps not in the way we expect, but they always manifest in reality somehow. And my grandmother was shown her bonded partner in the flame, and 50 years later she met him exactly as the vision predicted. And my mother saw her destiny, and it led her to become the head keeper of our house. And what happens if someone ignores their vision? And Daniel asked. Then they miss the opportunity the universe offered them. And Lyra said, and her expression, becoming serious, and they can still live good lives. But there is always a sense of something missing, and a path not taken. And most elves do not ignore visions from the sacred flame, because we understand that some things are bigger than our individual desires. Daniel thought about that while watching Ember groom Storm's wings, and the two dragons seemed to have complete trust in each other and worked together perfectly. And he wondered if that was what the vision was really about, and not romance, but partnership and cooperation. What exactly did the vision show you about this great darkness we are supposed to face together? And Daniel asked. Lyra looked out the window at the stars, and her expression troubled, and I saw shadows spreading across the galaxy and consuming worlds, and I saw people from different species fighting each other instead of uniting against the real threat, and I saw technology failing and magic weakening, and both our peoples struggling alone when they should be working together. That sounds pretty serious. And Daniel said, and do you know when this is supposed to happen? The sacred flame does not show time in the way we understand it, and Lyra explained. And it could be tomorrow or 10 years from now, but the vision was strong enough that I knew I needed to find you and begin building the bridge between our peoples before the darkness arrives. Daniel leaned back in his chair and processed this information. And so you are not just here because of some romantic prophecy, but because you think we need to prepare for something dangerous. Romance may come or it may not. And Lyra said, and her cheeks turning a slightly darker shade that might have been a blush. But the primary purpose is partnership. And the dragons accepting you as secondary keeper means we are meant to work together and to combine the strengths of our different peoples. Storm chirped and nuzzled Daniel's neck again, and he reached up to gently stroke the dragon's head, and the scales felt warm and smooth under his fingers like polished stone that had been sitting in the sun. Tell me about being a dragon keeper. And Daniel said, and what does that actually involve? Lyra brightened at the question, and clearly happy to talk. About her passion, and dragon keepers are chosen by the dragons themselves usually. When we are very young and we bond with our dragons and learn to communicate with them and care for them and work with them as partners. And the dragons are not pets but equals who have their own thoughts and feelings and desires. What can they do besides fly? And Daniel asked while watching Ember, who was now playing with a napkin on the table. They can breathe different types of energy, depending on their color, and Lyra explained. And Storm can generate powerful winds and small lightning strikes, and Ember can produce flames hot enough to melt metal. And they can also sense emotions and intentions and communicate telepathically with their keeper, and apparently now with you as well. Daniel blinked in surprise. And telepathically, and I have not heard any voices in my head. You will learn. And Lyra said with confidence, and the bond takes time to develop fully, but if you pay attention, you might already be sensing their emotions. Daniel focused on Storm, who was still sitting on his shoulder. And now that Lyra mentioned it, he could feel something like a warm contentment radiating from the dragon. And it was subtle, but definitely there. And when he concentrated on Ember, he felt playful curiosity mixed with excitement. I think I do feel something, and Daniel admitted. And that is strange. And I always thought telepathy was just science fiction. For humans, perhaps, and Lyra said, but for my people it is as natural as breathing, and dragons have always been telepathic creatures. And that is why they are so good at choosing their keepers, and they can sense the true nature of a person's soul. What did they sense in me? And Daniel asked, and curious despite himself. Storm sent him a feeling that translated roughly to safety and strength and reliable. And Ember added something that felt like kindness and curiosity and open heart, and Lyra was watching him with those starlight eyes, and they see what I saw in my vision, and someone who can be trusted with important responsibilities, and someone who cares about doing the right thing, even when it is difficult. Daniel felt uncomfortable with so much praise from someone who barely knew him, and I'm just a regular guy, and I follow orders and do my job and try not to mess up too badly. That is exactly what we need. And Lyra said, and not someone who seeks glory or power, but someone who simply does what needs to be done, and the universe is wise in its choices. Daniel Brooks. They talked for another hour, and Daniel learned about elven culture and their connection to nature and how they viewed magic as a science that humans had not yet learned to measure, and Lyra learned about human military structure and Earth's history, and why Daniel had joined the fleet in the first place. He told her about growing up on a small farm and working with his hands and wanting to see the stars. And she told him about climbing the great trees of her homeworld and finding dragon eggs and knowing from the moment they hatched that her life would be dedicated to their care and protection. By the time they finished their drinks, Daniel realized he actually liked Lyra as a person, and not because of any prophecy, but because she was intelligent and passionate and had a good sense of humor. And she asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to his answers. "So what happens now?" And Daniel asked as they prepared to leave. "Now we spend time together," and Lyra said, "and we let the bond develop naturally, and you learn about dragons and I learn about humans. And we see if the sacred flame was right about us being good partners. And if it turns out we are not compatible." And Daniel asked, "Then we part as friends," and Lyra said simply, And I return home. And you continue your life. And no harm done except perhaps some gossip on the station." Daniel smiled, "And I think I can handle gossip, and all right, Lyra. Moon whisper, and let us see where this goes." Storm chirped happily, and Ember did a little loop in the air, and Lyra smiled so brightly that Daniel felt his heart do something strange in his chest. Maybe the sacred flame did know what it was doing after all, as they walked out of the cafe together with station residents watching them with interest and the dragons flying between them like living bridges. Daniel thought about how his boring routine life had transformed into something extraordinary in just a few hours, and somewhere on a distant world a sacred flame burned quietly, knowing that it had once again set two souls on the path they needed to walk, and the rest was up to them. 3 weeks passed since that first meeting in the trading post, and Daniel found himself spending more time with Lyra than he had planned. And what started as curious conversation had become genuine friendship, and maybe something more, though neither of them had spoken about it directly. Lyra had taken temporary quarters on the station, and Daniel helped her understand human customs and technology, while she taught him about elven culture, and how to better communicate with Storm and Ember, and the dragons had become constant companions, following them everywhere they went. Daniel discovered that being a secondary keeper was harder than it looked, and the dragons required constant attention and care, and they had specific dietary needs that meant Lyra had to import special foods from her home world, and they needed exercise, which meant taking them to the station's cargo bay where they could fly freely without disturbing anyone. One afternoon, Daniel was in the cargo bay watching Storm and Ember practice aerial maneuvers, and they swooped and dove through the open space with incredible grace, and their scales catching the artificial light and creating rainbow patterns on the walls. "You are getting better at sensing their needs," and Lyra said from beside him, and she stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "And this morning you knew Storm was hungry before I did." Daniel smiled, "And they make it pretty obvious when they want something," and Storm just kept nudging my hand toward the food container. "That is not what I mean." And Lyra said, "And you sensed his hunger through the bond and not through his behavior. And the connection is growing stronger." Daniel focused inward and tried to feel what the dragons were feeling, and there it was like a second heartbeat in his chest, and he could sense Storm's satisfaction at flying well, and Ember's playful desire to show off, and both dragons' content acceptance of him as part of their small family. "How long does it usually take for a secondary keeper bond to form fully?" And Daniel asked. Lyra looked surprised, and in the old stories it took months or sometimes years, but your bond is developing faster than any I have heard of, and perhaps because the sacred flame brought us together, or perhaps because you have a natural gift for this. Daniel watched as Ember suddenly dove toward them and landed on his outstretched arm, and the dragon chirped and sent him a feeling that translated to "watch this," and then flew back up and performed a complicated spiral that ended with a burst of golden flame show-off. And Daniel said with affection, and Ember sent back something that felt like laughter. Lyra touched his shoulder. "And there is something I need to tell you, and my house has sent word that they want me to return home soon, and they are concerned that I have been away too long." Daniel's chest tightened. "And how soon?" 2 weeks, and Lyra said quietly, "And unless I can give them a good reason to let me stay longer, what would count as a good reason?" And Daniel asked, though he thought he already knew the answer, "If I could tell them that I have found my bonded partner, and that we are beginning the formal courtship rituals." And Lyra said, "And her," starlight eyes searching his face, "and then they would allow me to stay as long as needed." Daniel felt Stormland on his shoulder, and the dragon sent him a feeling of encouragement mixed with hope, and Ember flew to Lyra's shoulder and did the same. For her and the dragons wanted them to be together. And that much was clear. "I care about you, Lyra," and Daniel said slowly. "And these past 3 weeks have been amazing. But I do not know if I am ready to commit to formal courtship or whatever that means in your culture, and we have only known each other for such a short time." "I understand," and Lyra said. And though her expression showed disappointment, "And among my people we spend years in courtship before bonding permanently. And it is not a quick decision, but I need to at least tell my house that we are exploring the possibility." Daniel looked into her eyes and saw the fear there, and not fear of him, but fear of being separated, and fear of leaving behind something important before it had a chance to grow, and he realized he felt the same fear. "Okay." And Daniel said, "And tell them we are formally courting by elven standards, and that will buy us more time to figure out what this is between us." Lyra's smile was like sunrise, and she impulsively hugged him. "And thank you, Daniel, and you will not regret this." The dragons launched into the air and performed synchronized loops, and their joy radiating through the bond so strongly that Daniel laughed and felt lighter than he had in years. That evening, Daniel was called to his commander's office, and Captain Rodriguez was a stern woman who ran the human military presence on the station with efficiency and fairness, and she gestured for Daniel to sit down. "I have been hearing interesting reports about you," and Rodriguez said, "and something about elven prophecies and dragon bonding." Daniel tried not to squirm. "And yes, Captain, and I have been spending time with one of the elven visitors, and her dragons have accepted me as a secondary keeper." Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, and I looked into this, and apparently secondary keepers are extremely rare. And the last recorded case was over 800 years ago. "And do you understand what you are getting involved with?" "Not entirely." And Daniel admitted, "And I am learning as I go." The captain pulled up a file on her computer, and I did some research because I wanted to make sure you were not being manipulated or coerced. And from what I can tell, the elven people take these bonds very seriously, and if you formally commit to this, you will be considered part of their house. And that comes with responsibilities and expectations. I have not formally committed to anything permanent." And Daniel said, "And we are just courting." Rodriguez looked at him over her computer, and "Lieutenant, you are a good officer, and I do not want to see you make a decision you will regret. But I also recognize that opportunities like this do not come along often, and the elves are valuable allies, and building stronger connections with them could benefit both our peoples. So you are okay with this?" And Daniel asked, "As long as it does not interfere with your duties." And yes. And Rodriguez said, "And in fact, Command has expressed interest in having someone who can bridge the cultural gap between humans and elves. And if this relationship develops into something permanent, you might find yourself in a unique diplomatic position." Daniel had not considered that angle, and he had been so focused on his personal feelings and the dragons and Lyra's bright smile that he had not thought about the bigger picture. "Just be careful," and Rodriguez added, and be honest with yourself and with her about what you want, and do not let prophecy or pressure push you into something you are not ready for." Daniel left the office with a lot to think about, and he found Lyra waiting for him in the corridor outside, and Storm and Ember flying lazy circles above her head. "Everything okay?" and she asked. "Yeah," and Daniel said, "and my captain basically gave us her blessing, and she thinks this could be good for human-elven relations." Lyra smiled, but her eyes were serious, and what do you think, Daniel? And forget about relations between our peoples, and what do you want? Daniel looked at the dragons and then at Lyra, and he thought about the past 3 weeks and how much brighter his days had become with them in his life. And he thought about the easy conversations and shared laughter, and the way Lyra listened to him like what he said actually mattered. "I think." And Daniel said slowly, "And I want to see where this goes, and I want to keep learning about you and your world, and I want to understand this bond with the dragons, and most of all I want you to stay so we can figure this out together." Lyra took his hand, and her skin warm and soft, and that is all I needed to hear. Storm and Ember landed on their joined hands, and the dragon sent waves of approval and affection through the bond. And in that moment, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Over the next week, Daniel and Lyra spent even more time together, and they explored the station and tried different foods and taught each other games from their respective cultures. And the dragons were always with them, and their presence becoming as natural as breathing. Daniel learned that Lyra loved music and could play an instrument that looked like a cross between a flute and a harp, and she learned that Daniel enjoyed sketching and often drew pictures of the ships and stations he visited. One night they were sitting in the observation deck watching the stars, and the dragons were curled up asleep between them, and Lyra turned to Daniel with a serious expression. "The sacred flame showed me more than I told you before," and she said quietly, "and it showed me that the coming darkness will test us in ways we cannot imagine, and that many will suffer if we are not prepared. What can we do to prepare?" And Daniel asked, "We need to convince both our peoples that cooperation is essential." And Lyra said, "And humans have technology that could help protect against what is coming, and elves have magic and knowledge that humans need, and together we might stand a chance. And if we cannot convince them," and Daniel asked, "then the darkness wins," and Lyra said simply, and everything. "The sacred flame showed me. Ends in shadow." Daniel squeezed her hand, "And then we had better not fail." Lyra smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "And with you beside me, I believe we can succeed." And as they sat together under the artificial stars with two dragons sleeping peacefully nearby, Daniel thought about destiny and choice, and how maybe they were not as different as he once believed. 2 months had passed since that first meeting in the trading post, and Daniel had never been happier, and his relationship with Lyra had grown deeper than he thought possible, and the bond with Storm and Ember was now so strong that he could sense their emotions even when they were in different parts of the station. Lyra had received permission from her house to stay longer, and Daniel had been assigned to work with her on a cultural exchange program that would bring more humans and elves together to share knowledge and technology, and everything seemed to be falling into place. Then the warnings started arriving. It began with small things and ships disappearing in distant sectors and colonies losing contact with their home worlds, and strange readings on long-range sensors that did not match any known phenomena. And at first the station authorities thought it was just normal space hazards or equipment malfunctions, but Lyra knew better. She woke Daniel in the middle of the night cycle, shaking his shoulder urgently, and Storm and Ember were both agitated and flying around his quarters in distressed circles, and their usual calm replaced by nervous energy. "The sacred flame sent me another vision," and Lyra said, and her face pale and frightened, "and it is happening. Daniel, and the darkness is coming, and we have less time than I thought." Daniel sat up quickly. "And how much time? Days and maybe hours." And Lyra said, "And I saw it consuming a nearby system and spreading like a plague. And we need to warn everyone now." They rushed to the command center and found Captain Rodriguez already there, and she was reviewing reports from multiple sources, and all of them telling similar stories of something wrong spreading. "Through space, Captain, we need to evacuate the station," and Daniel said without preamble. Rodriguez looked up, and her expression grim. "And I was just about to give that order. And we have reports of an unknown energy field moving toward this sector, and it has already destroyed 3 outposts and consumed 2 small colonies." "What kind of energy field?" and Lyra asked. "We do not know." And Rodriguez admitted, "And our sensors cannot get a clear reading, and ships that get too close lose all power and go dark, and nothing we do seems to stop it or even slow it down. It is not just an energy field," and Lyra said, "and it is a manifestation of something older and darker than your technology can measure, and the sacred flame called it the void hunger, and it consumes all energy, whether technological or magical." The command center went silent, and everyone staring at Lyra. "You're saying this thing eats energy?" And Rodriguez asked. "Everything is energy in different forms," and Lyra explained, "and matter, and light, and thought, and life itself, and the void. Hunger devours it all, and leaves nothing behind, and not even empty space, but true void and absolute nothingness. How do we fight something like that?" And Daniel asked. "We do not fight it, and we contain it," and Lyra said, "and my people did this once before 10,000 years ago. And that is when the sacred flame was created. And they used a combination of elven magic and ancient technology to create a barrier that held the void hunger back, but that barrier is failing now. And that is why it has returned. Rodriguez processed this information quickly. And what do you need? I need to contact my homeworld and gather the Dragon Keepers, and Lyra said. And I need human scientists and engineers who can work with magical concepts, and most importantly, I need time to prepare. How much time do we have? And Rodriguez asked. The communication officer suddenly called out, and Captain, we have incoming and multiple ships dropping out of faster than light travel. The view screen showed dozens of ships appearing in space around the station, and some were human vessels, but others were elven. And there were also ships from species Daniel had never seen before, and all of them converging on Omega 7. What is happening? And Daniel asked. They are responding to the threat, and Rodriguez said, and her fingers flying across her console. And I am receiving messages from Fleet Command, and they are establishing Omega 7 as the rally point for a joint defense force. Lyra grabbed Daniel's hand, and the sacred flame must have sent visions to others as well. And this is what I saw. And people from different worlds coming together. Over the next several hours, the station transformed into a war. Command center and delegates from multiple species arrived, and brought with them knowledge and resources and weapons. And Daniel found himself thrust into a coordination role, because he was one of the few humans who understood both technological and magical concepts. Lyra worked tirelessly with the other Dragon Keepers who had arrived, and there were 5 of them in total, and each one bonded with their dragons, and together they began weaving a magical framework that would form the basis of the containment barrier. Daniel worked with human engineers to create technological anchors that would stabilize the magical structure, and it was unprecedented cooperation between science and magic, and nobody was sure it would work. But they had to try. Storm and Ember were essential to the process, and as the only dragons with a secondary keeper, they could bridge the gap between the purely magical constructs and the technological systems, and Daniel spent hours in deep meditation with them and learning to channel energy in ways humans had never done before. The void hunger was getting closer, and they could all feel it, now like a pressure on the edge of consciousness, and ships that went out to scout came back with reports of space itself dissolving and stars winking out of existence and planets crumbling to dust. We have maybe 12 hours, and one of the elven keepers said, and her name was Vera, and she was old even by elf standards, and if we cannot complete the barrier, by then the void will reach this station. Can we evacuate everyone in time? And Rodriguez asked. Evacuate to where? And Vara replied. And the void is spreading in all directions, and there is nowhere to run, and we stand here, or we all fall. Daniel looked around the command center at all the different species working together, and humans and elves and reptilian traders and crystalline beings made of living light, and even the mysterious shadowed people who rarely interacted with others, and all of them united by the common threat. This is what the sacred flame showed you, and Daniel said to Lyra, and not just us but all of us. Yes, and Lyra said, and squeezing his hand, and this is why we needed to find each other first, and to prove that cooperation was possible, and to build the bridge that others could follow. The work continued through the night cycle, and engineers welded technological components, while dragon keepers wove magical patterns, and scientists calculated energy flows, while mystics chanted ancient words, and slowly, impossibly, a framework began to take shape. Daniel could feel the barrier forming through his bond with the dragons, and it was like a web stretching across space and anchored at multiple points, and powered by a combination of fusion reactors and living magic, and held together by the will and hope of thousands of individuals. Then the void hunger arrived. It appeared on their sensors as nothing, and literally nothing, and a sphere of absolute emptiness that devoured everything it touched, and it moved toward the station like a wave of young creation. The barrier is not complete, and one of the engineers shouted, and we need more time. We do not have more time. And Rodriguez said, and activate what we have. Lyra closed her eyes and reached out through the Dragon Keeper network, and all 5 keepers linked their minds together, and the dragons added their strength, and Daniel felt himself pulled into the connection, and his bond with Storm and Ember making him part of the Gestalt consciousness. Through their combined awareness, Daniel could see the barrier as it truly was, and not a physical structure, but a declaration of existence against non-existence, and a statement that life and energy and matter had the right to be. The void hunger crashed against their incomplete barrier, and the impact sent shockwaves through the station, and people were thrown to the ground, and systems flickered and died and then came back online. Hold it, and Vera commanded. Through the mental link and everyone hold, Daniel felt like he was being torn apart, and the void hunger was so much stronger than they expected, and it pushed against their barrier and seeking weaknesses and trying to unravel the magic and overload. The technology Storm and Ember were glowing now, and their scales radiating pure energy, and they flew in complex patterns above the command center and creating additional anchor points and strengthening the barrier through their bond with Daniel. We need more power. And one of the human engineers gasped, and the reactors are at maximum and we cannot sustain this. Then Lyra did something that made everyone gasp. She began to sing. It was not a song in any normal sense, but a harmonic frequency that resonated with the fundamental structure of reality. And the other elven keepers joined her, and their voices blending together, and the dragons added their own musical sounds, and together they created a tone that made the barrier shine. Daniel understood what they were doing, and they were not just holding back the void but transforming the barrier itself and making it not just a wall but a lens, and taking the void, hunger's destructive energy, and redirecting it back on itself. He joined his voice to theirs, and he could not match the elves' musical perfection. But Storm and Ember amplified his effort and his bond with them, allowing him to contribute to the harmony. Other species began adding their own sounds and their own energy, and the reptilian traders created deep thrumming tones, and the crystalline beings chimed like living bells, and even the shadowed people whispered words in languages nobody understood. The barrier completed itself,